Oh, after that incredible intro music from an unnamed source, welcome to another episode of Grace Expectations. I'm Reverend Blayze White, and I'm joined as ever by the ineffable, the inexplicable, and the unknown Joseph Sheldon.
Hello.
Yeah, got a lot to live up to now.
I do, yeah. A lot to... Pride cometh before fall, so...
Well, I mean, the thing I've purposely waited to decide recording to ask you is, have you even Googled Pride and Prejudice? Not Pride, Great Expectations. Or Pride and Prejudice. It's another good book.
So, from my understanding, it's about a young man who suddenly lives in a quaint little village by himself. Really likes his, alone time. Very neat in particular and tidy. And then one day, there's a stranger just comes to him. A very tall man, donning a grey cloak, and beckons him on an adventure, which he obviously refuses because he likes his little hole. Thinks nothing of it, but the man goes away, and then just at night, as he's preparing dinner, knock at the door. He opens the door. A guest wanders in and helps himself to food. Closes the door. Another knock on the door. Another guest. He ends up having 12 people come round, and he's something trying to feed them all.
This is The Hobbit.
It is. It is The Hobbit. I read the wrong synopsis. My bad.
Did you Google Great Expectations then?
Well, I did, and that's what I got. So I'm just gonna have to Google it again.
It's a good start. It's a good start. Do you know the main character's name?
Well, I thought it was Bilbo, but obviously, obviously I'm wrong.
So, do you know who wrote Great Expectations?
Again, I thought it was Tolkien, but again, apparently,
I
looked at the wrong book.
So far off. You looked up An Unexpected Journey, not Great Expectations.
Yeah. That's just where I got wrong.
Do you know who wrote Great Expectations? Out of interest.
I'm telling you, Blayze. I thought it was Tolkien.
My days. Charles Dickens.
Well, we've just read it now.
It's not a spoiler. The story will still be there. I mean, if we're going to have a podcast named Grace Expectations, a pun on Great Expectations, I feel like you need to... I think with every episode we do, you should have a bit more knowledge on that book.
Yeah, and again, I tried Blayze, but I obviously read the wrong book.
There's a radio series, a comedy it's a Dickensian comedy called Bleak Expectations, which is a kind of parody radio comedy based loosely on Great Expectations. So that's very good. Yeah,
I'm sure I would have found that interesting if I read the correct synopsis and everything.
That's it. You've just finished listening to the Audible version of The Hobbit.
I did. I was so excited as well. I was like, "Oh, just wait till I talk to Blayze. I'm telling everything about this book." It's the wrong book.
That's it. But busy times. So what we're going to look at talking about today is what it's like being a dad. Not just any dad. A kind of young, middle-aged maybe dad.
A Chad dad.
A Chad dad. What's a Chad dad?
It's that thing. It's like the opposite of a female Karen. Chad is like that typical.
Oh, is it?
Typical American-esque alpha male kind of guy.
Wow.
Also really complaints and stuff like that, but
I didn't know. I knew about the Karen thing. I didn't know about Chad.
Yeah, the counterpart to that is Chad.
So Karen's
no relation to the country Chad. Just
wow. Unlucky them.
Yeah, exactly. They're just all Chads.
Yeah. Well, I mean, because we spoke a little bit last time about, what it was like having, being a younger person in the church. So you're quite rooted in the Church of England at the moment. I'm of course a minister in the Methodist Church. And what's the kind of makeup of the congregation, like the place you go attend worship at? What's maybe the average age?
Heavily elderly woman.
Right. Are there any other dads there? like dads with kids still living with them?
Nope.
No, yeah.
The only dad. We did have a vicar, but he is left, so I'm now the sole father. of the church.
Yeah, see, I've got 3 churches, and I think, unless I'm greatly mistaken, I'm the only dad that attends who's got children who still live with him.
Oh wow!
I know some mums. We've got some mums who come with their younger children, but I think I don't think I'm
So
missing out. Yeah, I'm the only dad with kids still living with him who attends any of those 3 churches.
I find that quite surprising, considering you attend 3. I
Yeah,
know, especially you live in quite like a populated area. Well, I'm like quite rural. I remember when I lived in Sheffield, I went to City Church, Sheffield, and that was like very, very heavily family congregations. So a lot of dads, a lot of mums. So I would have thought at least one of your churches would be.
And the thing is, I mean, I think you look at more traditional churches, like the Methodist Church, the Church of England, and a more traditional kind of church setup. I mean, you mentioned it last time that the biggest demographic missing from churches is middle-aged men. And
Middle-aged. I
so,
think it's middle-aged working class men. I think
yeah.
that's just a punch in the dark, but I think it might be that.
I wouldn't be surprised. So it's. I mean, it's extra. Do you have?
Yeah, sorry. Yeah, I was talking to someone in the.
Just cut me off. That's fine. Keep going.
So, you know your place on my podcast. I think it's the church. Yeah, the church army. Someone was talking to one of the people that worked there, and they were mentioning that was the working class male that they're struggling to reach. So yeah, I think it is the working class male.
I mean, how does the church act though when you go in with because you've got 3 girls, of course. Like, how do they react when they see you coming in? This, the only, not just only a father of that church, the only parent at that church with kids still with him.
Yeah, well, they're very delighted. The church I go to, they've made it very warm and welcoming for us as a family. I remember actually multiplied, but when we had the vicar there, he made it very clear that it's okay for our kids to make noise. And then when we just had when he left, and we're now like, what's the word? I can't even remember the word. But basically, waiting for a vicar. We have other vicars coming in. We had other vicars saying, "Don't worry about the kids making noise." Da, 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 da. So it is very like. I think it kind of brings a bit of life into the church. All the kind of elderly people there, you can see, especially when my girls run up and down the aisle to collect when we go up for communion. They're just their faces light up when they see them. So it's definitely, I wouldn't say it's off-putting because they made it so welcoming. But it's very warm. I think for us, but I have been to a church where one of our kids were told to be quiet, and we were like right in front of the church as well, and I was fuming.
It just takes away from everything. It's so hard to focus on anything else. Like, especially when you're your dad, you're there trying to like represent as your family. You're also trying to have your Sabbath, your day of rest, your day of worship, and someone comes up to you and says, your child, or it says to your child or to you, you need to be quiet. Like, all of a sudden, changes everything.
It does, and I remember because I was very keen on trying to find, because we moved and we were like trying to find a home church, and I was leaving my wife for a period of time, so I was really keen
for
on
work,
finding a church.
not
for work. Oh yeah.
We need to clear that up.
To run through the fields, finding anyone I can find. For work, to clarify. And I wanted to find a church that she could go to quite easily with the kids and felt settled in. And I was like, this could be the church. We got recommended this church. And they decided to have the kids section where they play right at the front of the church, which is always awkward and concerning, I feel, for parents. Just don't do that. Have it at the back of the church, please.
Absolutely.
But right at the front of the church. And then it wasn't just anyone in the congregation. I think it was basically from my understanding, the children leaders, basically run the children ministry there, told my daughter and my wife basically, can you be quiet? Da, 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 da. whilst there was other kids being loud, and it was wrong of me, but I made it very known that I was not happy, because I was there too, but I think
Was
I
this
went
your
out.
first time at the church as well?
It was, yeah, first time at
Like,
the church.
what a poor witness.
Yeah, and I think, yeah, and it annoyed me because my wife, she was like, oh yeah, this could be a nice church, and then that completely just crushed it. She felt uncomfortable there, and quite unjustly treated, considering those other kids who were like the leaders' kids being noisy.
Well, there's something there as well. So I don't know if your wife's the same as mine, but like when someone makes a comment about the
They're
children
different
being
people.
too loud, they are different
They're
people. We're not
just to
that
clarify.
close. You ran off to leave your wife. I moved in. It was great. No, very different people. But when you go up to a family, or your kids being loud, or your child's told to be quiet, something like that, like my wife immediately takes that as a knock on herself. Like, feels like, oh well, I'm now being judged for not being a good enough parent. I'm now being judged for not having control of my children. And it's like you say, Sunday worship, it's a Sabbath. It's a day of rest where we can go and we can worship and we can really just lean and fall into God. And then all of a sudden you've got that thought of, oh, everyone's now watching that. Everyone thinks that my children are being loud. I'm not being seen as a good parent, and end up leaving feeling worse than when you arrived.
And it's interesting because just now, the story of Jesus when the kids were around, and people were like, "Oh, Jesus, send the kids away," blah blah blah. And Jesus was very much like, "No, they're staying." And yeah, culturally, the kids were expected to be mature and older, but still, people found them a nuisance, even then. So, I do agree, it is a bad witness to tell kids not to be kids. Obviously, you got there's a health and safety aspect to it. Like, don't let kids run across all the wires. Like, can control your kids within reason. But if they're playing, they're playing. You set out the toys right in front of the church. What do you expect?
My first job as a youth worker, where I made loads of mistakes, but we got into it, me and the leadership team at one point, because they wanted the youth that we had at the time, they're more like youth than they were kids, but they wanted them to come sit at the front and move all the toys there. And I said, no, that's ridiculous. I said, no, they should sit at the front. That way everyone can see them. And it's this thing of, well, these aren't trophies for you to show off to the rest of the congregation going, oh, look at the young people we have. I said to them, if you take them to the front, I'm going to be bringing the activities, the crafts, and everything to the front, and we'll be setting up there. And I will not be encouraging them to be any quieter than I would at the back.
Yeah.
Because but that was a point of contention. They were very desperate, though, to be... You talk about, like, when your girls run up and down the aisle or whatever at church, and it's the same for my kids. Like, people are beaming, like, oh, look at these young people we have. They're so happy with it. But they're not just a trophy. We can take great happiness and joy in the fact that we have young people at the church, but they're not just a trophy to go, well, they need to be quiet and just looked at and thought, oh, wonderful, we have them. They need to be allowed to be them.
Yeah. Yeah, well, you came to my church when it was my girl's dedication, and you can see like right at the back, they have a table there, they've got toys, they got like colouring in and all sorts. So it is very much, I definitely feel it's important for churches to allow that space. Like, I know another church, but also not to be afraid that or think that, if the kids are there and playing, they have to go to a different room. Because I know, like, now the church is very legalistic, and somewhat areas it needs to be that way to keep things safe, like safeguarding. But they'll be like, oh, well, the kids are going to go out now, but because we don't have enough leaders, a parent has to supervise their child. And again, when Elizabeth and I were like searching for a church, knowing that I'd be away with work, we'd go to this church, and it was like, and this was an Anglican church this time. It would be like, right, kids activities now, you can go, but a parent has to go with her. With them. And then Elizabeth was like, yeah, the church is nice and good, but I'm not going to get anything now because you're not going to be here, and I'm going to have to go out every Sunday. I think if that's the case, just have the, because now the parent is missing out, and one could argue that the parent needs to hear it more than the kids, because they're not going to necessarily retain the sermon. So don't be afraid of actually having the kids section and the kids playing just at the back of the church. They don't have to leave just either turn up the mic a little bit on the vicar, or just accept it as a church.
But there's two things around. I mean, like so one of my churches you went to, ironically, for my daughter's dedication, and it's a small building, but we have a separate building. It's just part of the makeup of what we have. It makes it easier for bookings and things like that. So our junior church goes over to that other building, which means they can be as loud as they want. They can. That is their space. That is it's still church. It's still church building. It's still church activities, but it's theirs. But the expectation is not that it's that if a parent wants to join, they can do. They're more than welcome to. But the idea is you don't need to. I mean, we talk about the Sabbath. So the whole point of this is it's a day of rest, and so many parents need that. So many parents need that. You know, I've said this to a few of our leaders who are doing phenomenal Sunday school stuff at our churches, and where I said pretty much always brought by mum rather than dad, but just phenomenal witness. Oh, I've just remembered one. There is one guy at one of my churches who does have kids, still living with him, who goes, I'm not
He'll be listening to this podcast and he'll be like,
yeah,
what the hell?
His kids are so good. Like, his kids are so well behaved, and it's like, they're so knowledgeable. They're kind of secondary school age, but they're fantastic. But yeah, like if they go to this other room, that gives him, I'll use him as an example, that gives him this chance. He's got quite a few kids. It gives him this chance to just sit. He sits at the back of the church and he just listens. And you can tell that's just what he needs at the end of a long week. He works a hard job. He's got a good number of kids. And for an hour on a Sunday, he can have that. And we've said that to people who lead the junior church Sunday school. It's like you're providing such a wonderful ministry.
Yeah.
You're helping shape the next generation of Christian believers. You're leading them in worship, and you're giving these parents a chance to just breathe rather than thinking, "Oh, my kid's being loud" or this or that. They have the freedom to just sit for a while.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I think because I feel like, especially like we are the church communities. Like, you know, you've got connect groups and stuff like that, or Bible study nights and blah, blah, blah. Especially in rural places where numbers are limited, you don't always get those extra activities within the church. So that when you do go to church, you do want to, like you were saying, to sit there and breathe and just absorb it in. I know the church that we started going to before I left for work, from the church that we found, which was City Church in Sheffield, they had a little creche area. Again, we had a newborn with us as well, and you'd go up to the creche area, and they were considerate as well. They were like, actually, well, now parents, if they leave to go to the creche area when the baby starts crying or whatever, parents aren't going to be able to hear the sermon or the praise. So what they set up was a TV. And monitors and speakers. So, all right, you can be in there with your kid, you know, from 0 to 1 years old, or whatever, or 0 to 2, and don't worry, it's there. So now they don't have to worry about safeguarding because it's the parent is monitoring the child to the kids to the ratio, and also the parent's still getting fed because the kid's playing and they can still watch.
The other side to that, though, because I mean, absolutely. There's a church in our circuit that has that kind of crash bit where they've got the speakers on it. And it's relaying the service through those speakers, and that's brilliant. It's a wonderful thing to do. But even if you're a church that doesn't have that, even if you're a church that doesn't have another building or the volunteers or whatever, whoever is taking that service, whoever is preaching, needs to up their game if there is kids in that congregation being loud. It drives me mad when this is a pet peeve of mine. It shouldn't be, maybe, but it is. When I go to a church and I'm there with my kids or whatever, or there's other kids there and they're making noise, they're being a bit loud, and the preacher just carries on as they are, seemingly getting flustered or frustrated that there's children making noise. Like, no. This is your congregation. Work with it.
The kid, I think exactly. The kids are the congregation too. Like, I think you probably highlighted it there that people don't necessarily realize that when they're doing their sermon, this is for the adults. So no, this is also for the kids. Like when I remember when I was 5 years old, I was in the main service. We had a guest preacher come, He did an altar call, and I put my hand up.
Yeah.
So even at 5 years old, you know, you can still be. And he didn't change his sermon at all. He still made it. You know, he didn't dumb it down or anything like that. I just received and felt the Spirit call me forward. So that's, you know, you're preaching from children all the way to top end.
Every service is an all age service. Like,
yeah, exactly. Yeah, and that annoys me. It's like, oh, this is the all age service. It's like I think we touched on it last time. It's like, well, every service should be all age. It's just a service that we do slightly differently, maybe more energetic service.
Yeah. Because I remember when I first became a Christian, there was a family who had just started coming. They tend to come for a few weeks before the baptism, and then you never see them again, sadly, very often. But this family had started coming, and they had a very young baby, and it was crying like, it was screaming like. You could tell the parents felt uncomfortable. And it was a really lovely church. No one was judging them, but I think like when you see someone turn around because they hear a noise, you assume they're judging you, kind of thing. When it's just instinctual. And this preacher went over and said, "Oh, clearly there is someone else here who wants to share a good message," and went over to this family, took his lapel mic off and put it to the baby's mouth. And when the baby screamed and it came through this sound system, it just stopped. I was like, "Oh, what's this?" And he was like, "Yeah, it's good, isn't it?" And he started making jokes about it. It's like, "Yeah, this is why I do this. I get to have a microphone." And all of a sudden, the tension that the parents had felt had gone. The congregation felt a bit freer to be able to laugh about it, to be able to look around now. It didn't feel like they were thinking, "Oh, if I look around, they're going to think I'm judging." It just took the tension out of the room. And that is the job of whoever is leading that service. So I did a service Sunday just gone, one of my churches where we've just started getting quite a few more young people. We're very blessed at the moment. And one of we do have a kind of outdoor area where they go to do more stuff, just so it can be a bit louder, but it's just one room over and there's a big window, so they can still see us, they can still hear us. It's brilliant. But one of these kids, no, 2 or 3 of them actually seem to want to stay in the service. And so I went to the back and got a New Testament book from the back that we had at the church, and I got a £5 note out of my pocket without people seeing, put it in the Bible, and I went, my wife was there with some snacks for the kids. I got some chocolates off her, and I went up to one of these young kids, and I said, "Right, well, I'm going to give you a choice." I said, "Our reading today is all about choices. Our reading today is all about choosing to do the right thing." And I said, "Look, here's your choice. You can either have this Bible, this New Testament Bible, or you can have these chocolates. Which would you like?" And the kid did, what I think anybody would do. He took the chocolates. I was like, why wouldn't we? Of course, we take what is an immediate happiness. We take those chocolates. Good decision. Well done. And then I walk to the front and go, but we don't realize necessarily what we're passing up on. And I open the Bible and pull out a £5. But the kid's not upset. He gets all his chocolates. But his mum feels she can involve him a little bit more. It's a crass, little activity, but it's something to go, okay, well, you've decided to stay in the service. So maybe what I had planned is not as directed to you. So let's do something to make that not the case.
Yeah.
And well, I always take a deck of cards with me to church because I know a few magic tricks or something. So that a preacher should always be prepared for when a kid is there. It's not on the onus of the parents or the child to be completely silent. By all means, if they're letting their kid run rampant, then that's an issue. But if it's just the fact the kid wants to be there or wants to be free to do what they want, then it is the onus is on whoever's leading that service to make that work.
Now, I do agree that it's good for kids to be in the main service. So I was going to ask you, what do you think of having like kid sessions? So when the kids go out and the teenagers go out, what are your thoughts on that? Do you think they should be part of the church? I'm realizing we're verging very away from our original topic. But yeah, what do you think of them? Do you think the church should have them or shouldn't have those separation when it comes to the sermon? Because I find, I'll say this, I find it's often they'll go, "Oh, right, the sermon's happening, which you will find boring, so we're going to do something else," which I don't like the mentality behind that.
Mm-hmm. I think in a night. So the difficulty is, I think you've got what a lot of churches have, which is we only have a few young people, not enough to make something doable, maybe like having separate groups and separate things like that. Or you have maybe the ideal, which is you do have loads. And I think the issue, it should be an organic process. If you start getting so many kids, you go, okay, well, we've now got a discrepancy of age where we've got someone coming who's, 2 years old, all the way up to someone who's 16, 17 years old, or whatever it is. And we've got a nice full range there. The hope would hopefully be that you have this organic thing start out. We go, okay, well, we're going to do stuff that's a bit more directed towards those younger children. And then we're going to have something that's directed a little bit more to those teenagers. And as far as I'm concerned, when you start getting to those older age groups, you start leaning into a more service-like mentality. So it's like going through school. You look at the year 6 kids when you're in private school and going, oh, isn't it cool what they get to do? Isn't it cool that they play on this part of the playground or they do this? That's a grown-up cool thing to do. And then when you go to year 7, it's what are these people doing? In a similar way, it should be when you're at the children's part of a Sunday school maybe, or a junior church, going, oh, I can't wait till we get to do what they do. And then when you get to that point, it's something of, oh, I look forward to what I get to do when I get to go into church. And still, and also, if a sermon's boring, it shouldn't be. Those children should be like Ofsted. They should be able to turn around to the minister and go, look, I've been loving Sunday school. What you're doing is crap.
Yeah. But isn't that then inherently saying that the service, is just not for children? If we're having to build them up, go to year 1 of church school and then move them up through the years, is that just inherently saying that? In
an ideal world, what you're doing is educating those children on basic ideas of the Bible, of the stories, and of maybe more biblical language, to the point that when they actually get to sit in a sermon, they understand what's going on. So when I do a sermon, for example, for a church that doesn't have, I've got one church that has no young people going, and that's because mostly due to the area it's in, rather than any fault of the church. But when I preach to them, there's an expected understanding that they know certain terms, that they know of certain Bible stories. And I won't spend my time explaining those things, that I'll just naturally progress into them. And now, that's the
laying the foundations then for the kids and the youth. No, I get that. I feel that.
I said so. We have it at the church where they do go out. We have it at the end of each service. They come in, they show with us what they're doing. As the last week's one, they came in and showed us. I think it was Noah's Ark. But now there's this understanding. Okay, I know you know the story of Noah's Ark. I know you can tell me about that in some sense. So if one day you sit in the sermon and I'm preaching on that, and I say, well, actually, here's the deeper meaning of what's going on in that story, you already have that basic knowledge. Okay, I know what's being talked about here. And that's what makes all age services so difficult to some degree. When you tell someone, right, you've got to do an all age service now, and a lot of the people in the congregation don't have that maybe basic understanding, that has to be a very, it has to be a very spread sermon to try and edify those who are far more maybe biblically mature in their understanding, and those who really have no concept of it.
Yeah, definitely. And I feel that's more of I feel that's more our reality now. When it comes to churches, people used to always know Bible stories back, even I'd say in the 80s, 90s. People went to Sunday school. I know this story, but
it was expected.
Yeah. But now you're really approaching to the point where we knew someone at our who went to Bible college who didn't even realize that the film Noah wasn't an accurate representation of what was in the Bible. You get into that stage where people they just don't know. They don't read.
Well, I mean, my dad's an English teacher, and he told me maybe 2-3 years ago now, he said he was looking at a bit of literature with the class, and he said, well, this is kind of like a parable. And he said nobody in the class knew what a parable was. And that's that same thing of like, if I preach to that congregation where there's no young people, I'm not going to spend my time necessarily explaining what a parable is. I take it perhaps for granted that they know what that is. Yeah. If I'm doing an all-age service these days where we have a lot of kids in, I might explain a little bit more about what a parable is, or rather than using that term, I'll just use an explanation of it.
Yeah.
Because I can't know that they know it.
Yeah. because I had a conversation with someone. So I was away again with work, and I was talking to one of the guys that was with me. And again, I make it very, very clear, and I'm very open about my faith. And he wanted to ask. I was reading my Bible, and we were sharing rooms, and he asked me about it. It's like, oh, so what's the Bible for, and stuff like that, or what do you find in the Bible? Just all sorts. So I was telling him what I was reading, which was I was reading starting from Genesis. I was telling you kind of read the Bible for like the historical context, for like Psalms if you're feeling a bit low, Proverbs if you need a bit of wisdom, which I say I often read. I need a lot of wisdom.
Yeah, amen.
And so he's like, oh, so the Bible's basically got something for every part of life. And I was like, yeah, yes, it does. And I guess for me, I just assumed people would know that, but it's not. It's very apparent now, and especially the conversation that I have, that like that is not the case anymore. People don't know the Bible. People don't know what it offers, and don't know really what's in it, bar Jesus, Adam and Eve.
Yeah.
Or probably the two, Noah. They're probably the.
I mean, this is so. I remember when I first started reading the Bible. Like, I got my godparents bought me a Bible and a year Bible, and my mum asked me, proud. Oh, my son's reading the Bible, isn't this wonderful? And asked me in the car on the way back from college or something like that. I said, "Oh, so what are you reading at the moment?" And I think I'd just been reading about, one of the slaughters that happens in the Old Testament, and I was explaining this to her, and she goes, "Not in the Bible, you weren't." I was like, yeah, this is just there's nothing like that in the Bible. I was like, you're joking. I've been reading about adultery, I've been reading about babies' heads being smashed. I've been reading about. I said, this is a tough book, and she was like shell shocked. Like, this was in the good book.
Yeah. Well, again, I had a guy ask me, it's like, oh, what's like the baddest or weirdest thing like in the Bible? So I was like, well, I said there's a few. Doesn't mean it condones it. Just because I clarified, just because it's in the Bible doesn't mean it condones it. It's just telling the folly of man.
Yeah.
So I talked about. I said, for me, like Lot and his daughters, and it was like, what?
Yeah.
He's like, what's? I was like, yeah, it's messed up people, and that's why. And the end of Judges, with the whole kind of the murder and cutting up of the human remains and sending them across. And I was like, that's really messed up. And
it's all a brutal book.
Yeah, all points to why we need God, because we get more and more, depraved and thinking we can do our own thing, our own morality is the right morality, and it just goes down the toilet constantly.
I mean, this is where like circling it back to like being a dad at church, especially when I move my kids around from church to church, because I'm at a different church. I pretty much every week, so they come to the church I'm going to. The concern is that to some degree they're missing out on having that established. Right, this is our church. This is the Sunday school. This is the junior church or whatever it is they're attending, and they miss that opportunity to really have that kind of buy-in to that. And that's something that me and my wife take quite seriously. We read Bible stories to them in the evening. We pray with them and things like that. But it's harder, especially when you're the only one there with kids, or with kids that age, or whatever it is. It becomes a really tough thing to be like, okay, well, I want this. Like, as you say, if it's a sermon that really doesn't take into account the young people there, you think, okay, that's been really difficult keeping my kids, somewhat entertained in this, because this service really wasn't for them, or it's too. There's too much in it that they couldn't understand, but like I said, you don't want it to go the other way. You don't want them to do a service that's completely tailored to the kids and go, okay, well, everyone else here has missed out on something.
Yeah, well, that for me, like, slightly different. I'm obviously more established in the church that we go to, but because we're like the only family with kids, I worry for them when they get older that they're gonna grow up in a church where they've got basically no other Christian friends. I remember for me when I was growing up in church, so I went to church. I had my school friends and my church friends, but I was always wanted to go to church because I wanted to hang out with my friends from church.
Yeah.
And I think for me, and when we went away to like Christian events like Grapevine which is now One Event, which is now Awaken or something like that. It was really, to share that experience of connecting with God with like-minded, similar age people, I think is really important for your growth in your faith, I guess. Like, yeah, you're not doing it alone. Well, not important. It helps support you when you're feeling down. You got a friend that can go, oh, you might not want to talk to your parents. You got a friend to go, oh, let's help each other out. I know when we're together, we encourage each other in our faith. And I think I want that for my children, to have similar, like-minded people of similar age to encourage them in their faith.
There's a difficulty as well as far as, so I'm very aware, like as my job as a minister, someone with the dog collar, this that, and the other, that I think every kid goes through that stage where they rebel against mum and dad. And to some degree, so they should. That's their time to basically cast off the identity that's predicated on the parent and to try and establish one for their own. And that's fair enough. That day is coming. I'm not looking forward to it, but it's coming. But my concern is, especially if there's no one, as you say, no one else at that church who's their age, it becomes okay. Well, the easiest thing to rebel against is the parent's faith, because it's difficult to want to keep going there when there's no one else my age. It's difficult to keep going there if maybe there isn't the kind of preachers who are going to say, especially when I'm the only preacher they get to listen to. That's a real shame for them. The last thing they want is just to listen to dad, prattle on during a service. It'd be great for them to see other preachers. But to me, there's a concern of, okay, I really don't want that. I first became a Christian when I was, 16, 17. And I remember my godparents taking me to Spring Harvest, a Christian festival at Butlins, and just being amazed at how many young people there were there. It just seemed utterly baffling to me. I'd never seen young Christians. They just seemed such an anomaly. So it's trying to, bear that all in mind.
It is, yeah. And I think for parents, like, you get to the point, like, do you move church to find a church with kids? But that's not always guaranteed. That's a good church. They might be teaching all sorts or have a bad culture. But then if your church is, sound theology, great culture, Christian culture, do you just sacrifice the social part? Or do you go, no, the kids, what's more important, I guess, for kids growing up?
This is the big, for what it means to be a dad in the church, especially when there's not that many other kids. Like, me and my wife have spoken a few times that once the kids get to a certain age, if they start saying to us, we don't want to go to church, then, the difficulty is I will need to go to those churches. But, if for example, my eldest is nearly 4. If he turned around to me now and said, I really don't like going to church, it's boring, I don't want to go, whatever, I would be working hard to find a different church that we could all attend on one that met at a time when my churches weren't meeting, or on a different day, or something I could drop them off at before I went to church. And I'd for what it's worth, I'd be honest with the congregation of like, well, actually, we can't expect young people to stick around when there's no one else their age, or maybe just to be honest with myself about, maybe I shouldn't have the expectation for my kids to want to stick around in the churches when the only person they're hearing taking a service is their dad.
Yeah. I guess you kind of need. But then again, like, I know now, when I was growing up, there wasn't this, social media and Facebook and all that. Now there are a lot of
back in the day.
Now there's more, networking available for families, for Christians, and I guess for young Christians to be able to find, local young Christians in my area.
But especially since COVID as well, there's so many online churches now, or so many services that stream their services. It's not the same. I don't think it's as good. You're not there with the people, but like, these are things, like, in my mind as a dad, I'm like, okay, these are the conversations I'd be preparing for if my kids ever turn around to me and say that, they just don't want to go anymore.
Yeah, well, I remember, like, during COVID, when we were searching for a church, I just went online and listened to Matt Chandler, who's an American preacher, do a sermon. And I was like, oh, this is really good. But then he said, in my mind, I was like, oh, right, that's it. Well, I'm just going to have this as my church and just every Sunday, tune in to him preaching. But then that very sermon, he was like, look, we understand we've got a lot of people watching, that's good. We're happy for you to come and watch, but this can't be your home church if you're not, not coming here or living in the area. You really need to, your home church, you need to be surrounded by like-minded, surrounded by like-minded people. And you're not going to get that sitting at a couch, listening to me talk. Please go out and embed yourself in a church and be in that culture. More than welcome. Thank you for listening. More than welcome to come back and listen. But you need to be going out and surrounding yourself. And I was like, damn you, Matt Chandler.
Yeah.
Damn you.
I think that the point of this to some degree is, because we're talking about now, like when kids get set to a certain age, it's almost like there's this thing of we accept there maybe won't be anybody their age when they reach that age, which is maybe a realistic view, but also quite a pessimistic one. The hope, I think, is to some degree going, treat mums and dads better when they go into the church. Yeah. Or better yet, if you're a preacher, learn to adapt if children come into your service.
I grew up in a village and we went to a town church. And we had I remember growing up in it, and it had a great youth. There was lots of youth, and there was really lots of things going. They had a youth band, all sorts. And then one day it just all stopped. They all left because they went to uni. I think rural churches and towns and stuff like that, they fluctuate. And I remember it was like at one time we had like 20 plus people coming to youth group on Friday after school, and then suddenly it went down to 5. Almost like pointless, but we still came, and I thank God for a guy called Chris, and it was really thanks to him that he didn't have to, but every Friday he'll just be there and he'll put up a little Bible study, and we were dicks, we weren't listening or anything like that, but he still he put up with it, and did it, and I think he was a blessing to us and the church for doing that. But now I left, and now the youth group is grown again. And I know eventually that it will all drop off because they'll all move on to uni. And they just fluctuate. I don't think churches know what to do in those situations when they just got to drop off. And then so they all grow. So then they're starting from day one, week one. And they're like, oh, crap, like how do we do this youth stuff? And then they're figuring out because all the youth leaders have left and moved on, or they're old. And so they're every time starting again.
It needs to be organic. You get this hope of like, okay, so we have enough children now where actually it's, if my kids are the only ones in the church, you can just go, okay, we'll give them some activities at the back, or we'll let them play on the toys they bring. If there's a lot more of them, you kind of go, okay, well, we're going to give them another room so they don't need to be quiet. If there's even more of them, go, okay, well, let's have 2 different groups. And there should be this organic reaction to it. But you partly do that as well by, I've seen loads of churches that beat themselves up and go, oh, really, we need young people. And then whoever walks through the door who's not a young person, it's all of a sudden like, well, this is nice, but wouldn't it be wonderful if it was a young person? And that's a real shame. We should be so blessed by the people we have. Yeah,
100%. And I feel sometimes churches just need to own it. Like, we're not a young church. We are an old church. And so therefore, we will support the other churches who are, got young families. Yeah. You do you. That's obviously your ministry for the time. And our ministry is obviously for our demographic. And I think churches, like you say, get too hung up on, we need families. And it's good to have families, don't get me wrong. But they need to...
One of my churches is down near opposite a hospital. It's in a wealthy area, and it has an assisted living place nearby. There are no young people living in that area. And they do phenomenal stuff for that local community. And it's wonderful, but like they keep telling me, "Oh, we love it when your kids come. We'd love more of these kids to come." And it's like that. Maybe that's just not what you're here for, and that's not a bad thing. Like I attended they do a games afternoon where they get like puzzles out, they get rummy out, they get all sorts of things out. And there was a lovely lady who I got talking to when I was there, who was telling me about how since her husband died, she just doesn't get to bake anymore, and she loves baking. She goes, I love coming to this once a month because it gives me an excuse to bake, and I get to share it with people and talk to people. It's like, that's a ministry. That's amazing.
Yeah.
That, like, focus on that.
Yeah. I do get, like, when they don't have young families and there are an older generation, it is fear that this church will die because there's no one new coming in. But that's not necessarily, well, then you need young people. Or young families. It's, well, you need people coming in.
How do we serve our community?
Yeah, exactly.
I mean, I remember,
and that is by getting the men.
This is it. So I remember we went to a Salvation Army commissioning service once, and that whole weekend before we got there, my kids had been nightmares. Every kid goes through it. It was just like, it was a perfect storm. They were all going through this phase at the same time, and they were doing quite well on this one day. They were still being a little loud, but this lovely guy behind me at the end of one of these sessions at the commissioning service leant over, put his hand on my shoulder and said, I just want to compliment what an amazing family you've got. And I was so taken aback. I was like, oh, thank you. He said, yeah.
My family?
Yeah, exactly. It's like, really? Did you see them? He's like, they're just such a wonderful, vibrant family. It's wonderful to see. You're doing a great job. And that meant the world to me. Like, you talk about rest, you talk about the church serving its community and stuff. Instead of someone leaning over and going, your kids need to be quiet, instead of someone leaning over and being shush or whatever, feeling judged, it was just such a blessing for that man to lean over and say, you're doing a great job as a dad.
Yeah.
And a lot of dads need to hear that. A lot of mums need to hear that. It's a tough job being a parent. To have someone say, you're doing a good job and you've got a beautiful family. I was so touched by that.
Yeah, I think it just needs to make a environment that parents feel comfortable to go to. Like, having those encouragements goes a long way. And you don't really know what that person's going through, or that might mean the absolute world, like it meant the world to you. Yeah, but I just don't feel, as we mentioned the last time, that was it 97%. If the father comes to faith, it's 97% more than likely that the family will come to church. And I can't remember what the mum was. I don't have it with me, but it was very low in comparison. So, as we keep saying, circle it back around to the original topic. What can the church do or what do we think the church needs to do to amend that, or to reach out to men?
Broaden the definition of church. I mean, we talked about this in the idea of that New Places document the Church of England did, and church is a people. So, ironically, it's like the church that has a more elderly geography around it. We know, like, there's mostly women. We've got 2 men that come pretty regularly, and yet we do a service once every quarter at the local pub. When we do those services, all the husbands turn up. They love the idea that they get to have a drink while listening to the service. They love the idea they get a meal afterwards. They love it, and they all know each other. They all know the wives. It's a wonderful environment. And so I've started saying to them now, we need to start having services, or a different kind of service, at that pub more often.
That's funny you say that,
because another group at that pub.
That's how basically my dad came to church. We lived in Italy for a couple of years. My mum was a Christian, my dad wasn't, and they basically said, would he come if he played in the band? Because my dad was a musician as well. My mum was like, yeah. So he came, and then that day they offered food and wine at the end of the service, and they're like, my dad loved it, and they're like, well, would he come every week if we offered food and wine every week? And my mum was like, yeah, 100%. And it did. My dad came every week to play in the band and to eat and drink. And it was only near the end of our stay there when my dad realized that, these people actually struggle to afford the food and the wine that they bring every week, because it's very, very working class Italians. And and it was a struggle. It was a burden on them, but they did it gleefully and happily, just to get one person. One person, just get one person, and it, I guess in essence it worked, because at the end, before we left, a week before we left Italy, my dad became a Christian, and I remember his whole baptism.
Amazing. I mean, that's like a wonderful example of what it means to serve the community. Like, instead of going, okay, we have our church format, we have our church Sunday service, this is what we do. It's a hymn sandwich and this, that, and the other. Going, okay, well, you'll play guitar, great. Okay, you like this at the end of a service, great. Let's do this at the end of services. You don't. It doesn't stop being church because you have someone playing guitar. It doesn't stop being church because you have wine or something at the end. It doesn't stop being church if you have a service in a pub, or have it like we've got. He's moved now, sadly, but we had a gentleman who was a lorry driver, and he used to tell me how he didn't feel. He would have been great to join the church. He had kids who were still living with him. I would have had another one, but he said, whenever I join the church with my wife, it just feels like an old ladies club, and I really feel out of sorts. So we started a tough questions group, which met in a pub, and literally the whole premise was just come, any questions on the table, we'll chat about it over a drink. And it's not technically a Christian group insofar as you can invite anyone. He came to those, and he was really open about faith and this and that and the other, and ended up really connecting with what we were talking about, and really started saying, I've started praying, I've started this, that, and the other. And you think, okay, because you're serving your community, and that starts by this idea of, okay, well, church isn't serving you, and that's the real issue. That statement in of itself, church is not serving you. The people of God are not serving you. How do we do that in a way that's still authentic to our faith? Well, okay, we'll go out to the world as a presence in the pub.
They did it when after Jesus' death and the spread of Christianity, that they started up in Antioch, and I think they were looking at the remains of Antioch, and they said, "Do you know what? This is probably where they would have gone to." And it was basically like our version of a cafe, but where people socialized and play games, like board games. Yeah. And that's where they went. They went there, and that's probably where they had their conversations and their debates and everything like that. They were in the community,
but also meeting them where they are. You had that in Corinthians. You had that in Corinthians, this idea of if the people you go see struggle with meat, then don't eat meat around them.
100%. Yeah.
It's like, fair enough. Like, really, I mean, once again, if someone turns around and say, well, I feel uncomfortable when you mention Jesus, well, I'm not going to stop mentioning Jesus just because that makes you feel uncomfortable. Because you have those, like, what were they called, Sunday church or Sunday congregations, something like that sprouted up many years ago now, and it was you'd get together and just sing pop songs together instead of hymns. And you would have a talk on love that wasn't a sermon, right? It was just it was basically trying to suggest that people like the church format, but not the belief system. And then it was really popular for about 2 years and then died out. And people found out it wasn't that popular because it lacked substance. But as in, if you start asking me to do things that's contrary to my faith, then no, I'm not going to do that. But by all means, if you struggle with the idea of meeting in this building for a 5-hymn sandwich, then okay, let's do something different. If you struggle with bringing your kids and having to make them sit down and be quiet, then okay, let's do something that means that's not the case. Let's change how we do that.
Yeah, 100%. Like connect groups, I think are good. Bit intimidating if you're arriving at like a very established one and you're like the new person. You go in there, hello, nice to meet you. But if just at a pub where it's relaxed, or a cafe. I know when I went to a church in Newark, there was this guy, and he set up like. Was it? I think it was Alpha. He asked me to play the guitar in the corner, so I was like, "Hello," but it was just like random songs, like random pop songs. But they would talk about Christianity, and it was a bit like an Alpha in a cafe. People. That's where the community is. Go there. You're going to get people, like you said, who won't necessarily come to the church building, but they will come to a pub or they will come to a cafe.
Well, this is where it gets really strange, isn't it? Because of course we talked about how like language, so people don't know as much as they once did about the Bible, about Christian language, maybe, and things like that. We're also in a place now where some people genuinely feel like they can't walk into a church. I've spoken to people who are like, oh, I couldn't go to church, I'd burn. It's like, what a statement to suggest you're such a sinner that you would burn in a church, for a church that's made for sinners, like this. I've even spoken to. I've got a steward whose wife feels like that when she goes into a church, she's far too unholy. I'm like, that's an incredible thing to think about church, and yet,
And that's the thing. People say that to me all the time when I talk to them, like, "Oh, I can't go to church. I've done too much, or I'll burn.
yeah,
I've done, oh, dude," they'll be like, "Done too many things." And I'll be like, "You are aware who wrote the majority of the New Testament?" And like,
yeah,
"Who's that?"
yeah.
I'm like, "Paul." I was like, and they'll be like, "What about him?" I was like, "He murdered Christians, women, children, and men. Christians. He murdered them until God intervened." And they're like, "What?" It's like, yeah, the majority of the New Testament is written by a murderer who murdered Christians,
Yeah. Do you know the
but that he
person
was
who?
saved.
Do you know the person who wrote the majority of the Psalms sent his best friend to be killed so he could sleep with his wife? Like, yeah,
Exactly.
like,
Yeah, it's like it doesn't matter what you've done. Paul set the standard pretty high.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
So, and again, it's just people just don't know, or they just think if I become a Christian, it'll just be boring. Where it's not like your life becomes boring; you just don't do
So,
certain things.
so maybe the takeaway of this then is to some degree, like for the dads you do have in your congregation, whatever, give them a kind word, encourage them. Don't make kids just prescribed to this thing of sit down and be silent. And
Mm.
maybe if you don't have a congregation full of young people or young dads or young mums or anything like that, maybe think, well, where are those people and why aren't we there?
Yeah, I definitely feel like we need like maybe a part two of this because I feel like it can easily branch out. What talking to a lot of guys, and got family members who get annoyed where they feel that they're told that being a man is not right. Does that make sense?
Oh,
They're
like
too
what it means to be
masculine.
a man. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
They're too masculine. Always, you can't. You should feel sorry, and they're like just annoys them. They're very like typical manly
Mm.
men. Um, and this, I remember going to a sermon with a family member, and the guy made it very wet and soppy, and like, oh, got to whip ourselves for being men, and it just infuriated them to the point they just switched off.
That that would definitely need to be the part two of this, actually. Because maybe I think there is an element of that
Mm.
where we don't. When you think of masculinity, like if a dad comes out and they think of masculinity, they think, oh, okay, that's toxic masculinity we're
Yeah,
referring to.
and I definitely feel there is to brandish the term culture war on masculinity. You've got the very kind of
Yeah.
toxic side brewing up, and then you've got the opposite side. No, it's okay to be a man, but this is the proper way to be a man. And they're competing against each other. And then you just got the other side of people saying all masculinity is toxic, and you're a bit like, well, great.
It sucks to be me. Like, there's not a lot
Yeah,
I can do
exactly.
about it.
Yeah. So yeah, definitely maybe a part two because I definitely feel that is one of the reasons why you just
Yeah.
don't see men in churches. Like I remember sitting in a sermon, and I would say I'm quite a brash person.
I
I
would
don't
agree.
mind. Yeah, I don't mind the sense, having like a sensitive and emotional sermon. Sometimes you need that. That's good, and you need to hear it.
Mm.
But when you're always hearing that, and you're not getting you're going to war, you're going to fight. You just get bored. I remember sitting in the sermon, and all the like ministers were like, "Oh, and it was very softly spoken too." And I was like, "Okay, I'm falling asleep here." And they're like, "Oh, so good." And I was thinking, well, who was it directed to? It was directed to the women in the church and not to the men.
Yeah.
And it just went over my head.
I had
Uh,
a conversation with it was a logistics officer in the RAF last week,
mm,
and I asked him what it was like being a Christian in his kind of area, and he said, "Oh yeah, a lot of people, like as you said, look at it as quite an effeminate thing to do to go to church, and
mm,
not very masculine thing." And his response to me he said literally the linchpin of our faith is that Jesus took the worst that humanity had to offer, and then 3 days later he walked it off. That is the
mm.
manliest thing I can think of. And
Yeah.
I was like, yeah, that's okay. That's pretty true. Yeah. He took on the worst form of torture, of persecution, of rejection. And yeah, 3 days later, he walked it off as if it was nothing.
Mm. Yeah,
That's a
yeah.
pretty manly thing to do.
It is. It is. I think people often focus on the softer side of Jesus, but they avoid the very kind of harshness of Jesus in
Yeah.
surrounded in grace and love and forgiveness. But he made a whip. He planned. He was methodical. He came in. He came out swinging. you know,
This is it.
He is the perfect, example of, manhood.
Mm.
And I think we shouldn't be shy of that or try and hide it. But yeah, probably like a part 2.
Yeah, if you listen to this and you would like to hear another episode where we discuss biblical masculinity, not toxic masculinity, biblical masculinity, and maybe that's what I say. Maybe ending this with the fact that Jordan Peterson did that letter to the church, that video on YouTube. I don't know if you've seen it, where he says, the world is saying that it's rejecting men who are men because they're men, and that's toxic. He said the church should be the place to turn around saying, "We'll take you." And maybe that's how we get dads. Maybe that's how we help dads not feel so self-conscious in a church. Start really living up to and explaining what biblical masculinity looks like. So if you're interested in that, let us know. If we went off on too many tangents, let us know if we need to.
I feel like we very much avoided the topic completely.
Yeah.
Not on purpose, but it was just naturally how it happened.
Maybe there's not, because there's not that many dads in the church. It's difficult to talk about what it's like to be a dad in the church.
Yeah, I just it's lonely.
Yeah, it'd be nice to have others.
It's like when we all meet up as a friends group, it's great because we're all in a very similar situation. We're all strong, we all have our faith. Most of us have, families. And so we can relate, and it's nice to hear about, hear other people going through similar things. But because there's not many men in the church, you're not hearing that, and you're a bit like, well, it's quite isolating.
It makes there's a head teacher who comes to some of our services every now and then, and he brings his kids, and at the end he'll be there going, "Oh, my son was a little loud," so at the end I'll be there going, "I'm so glad your son was. It made my kids look amazing." Like, you come back, and luckily, like the next time he came, my kids were acting up, and he said, "Oh, my son looked incredible this week in contrast to yours." And it was just lovely. It was like, "Oh, great, I have this now," and we know we can joke about it because we know what it's like to be that dad in the congregation going, I really don't want my kids to be the focus point here. I don't want to be seen as like, oh, a bad dad. And so we can go up to that head teacher and go, "You're doing a great job." And nobody,
especially when you're the only dad with kids there, you're like, "Oh,
exactly, yeah. No, we
sit
need
away
more
from them."
That's it.
Sit away from them and look at your wife and judge her. Like,
that's what I did. I sat there at the front and said, "This head teacher with his kids, shocking." Well, so we'll leave it there. And let us know if you'd like another episode on this, or something about biblical masculinity, or if, frankly, any tangent we went off on today that you'd like us to touch on a bit further, then let us know. But that's the episode for now. So thank you for listening. Share us on whatever, I don't even know where people are listening, watching, or engaging with this, but share it in some way. Give it a like if you can. And let us know what you think. And we will see you next time.
Amen.